the lawyer walked into my wedding reception holding a sealed envelope with my mother's handwriting on it. 3 years after she died, and the first person to see his face go pale wasn't me. It was my stepmother, because she was the only person in that room who already knew exactly what was inside. My name is Rachel. I'm 29, and the woman who raised me from the age of 11 wasn't my mother. My mother, Diane, died when I was 10. I still remember pieces of her more clearly than I remember most of my 20s. The particular way she hummed while she cooked. Always slightly off-key, and never caring, the way she kept a small notebook by her bed in the last year of her illness, writing things down that she never let me read, telling me only that they were for later. I didn't understand then what later meant. I understand it now. 2 years after she died, my father married Susan, polished, generous in public, endlessly praised by everyone who only ever saw her from a distance. For 17 years, Susan built a very specific reputation in our family. The stepmother who never made Rachel feel like an outsider, who planned birthday parties and school events and, eventually, my entire wedding, down to the napkin folds. Everyone told me how lucky I was. I told myself the same thing, most days. It is a strange thing, to spend most of your life repeating a sentence to yourself, that you're not entirely sure you believe. What nobody outside our house ever saw was smaller, quieter, and much harder to explain at a dinner party, the way Susan would mention my mother only to compare her to herself, always gently, always with a small sympathetic smile. Your mom would have loved this, though I think I did it a little better, don't you think? The way certain boxes from my mother's old apartment disappeared. Within the first year Susan moved in, boxes I was told held nothing important. The way, whenever I asked about my mother's final months, about paperwork, about anything specific, Susan would grow soft and vague, insisting there was nothing left to go through, that Diane hadn't had much besides sentimental odds and ends. I believed her. For 17 years, I believed her, because believing her was easier than wondering what else there might be to know. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a household when everyone has silently agreed not to ask certain questions, and I grew up fluent in that quiet without ever quite realizing I'd learned the language. I want to tell you a little more about those years, because I think it matters for understanding what came later. Susan was not, in any obvious way, a cruel woman. She remembered my school events. She learned to cook the specific version of shepherd's pie I liked, the one with the crispy potato edges, because I'd mentioned once, only once, that my mother used to make it that way. She cried, genuinely, at my high school graduation. If you had asked me, at 20, whether I loved my stepmother, I would have said yes without hesitation, and I would not have been lying. But underneath all of that, there was always a second, quieter current. The sense that my mother's memory was something to be gently managed rather than honored. Every mention of Diane came wrapped in something that softened her, diminished her just slightly, recast her as someone whose absence had been, in some understated way, a kind of opportunity for the family to become closer, more functional, more complete. I didn't have the language for it back then. I only had the feeling, a small, persistent unease I learned to swallow, the way you learn to ignore a draft in an old house, because fixing it seems like more trouble than it's worth. My cousin, Melissa, was the only person who ever said anything to me directly. We were close as teenagers, and once, when we were 17, sitting on my bedroom floor during a sleepover, she asked me, quietly, if it ever bothered me how little anyone in the family talked about my actual mother anymore. I remember feeling strangely defensive, telling her that Susan had done so much for us, that it wasn't fair to make it complicated. Melissa didn't push. But she looked at me for a long moment in a way I've never forgotten, like she saw something I wasn't ready to see yet. I'm getting married this spring, to a man named Marcus, and Susan threw herself into the wedding planning with the kind of energy she reserved for things she wanted witnessed. Every detail became an opportunity to be seen as generous, thoughtful, endlessly capable. She chose the venue. She interviewed 3 florists before selecting one. She insisted, over my quiet objections, on giving a toast, framing it, months in advance, as a chance to finally say some things publicly. I let her have all of it. I told myself it made her happy, and it cost me nothing to let her feel needed. I think, if I'm honest, some part of me also still wanted to believe the version of her I'd built my whole adolescence around. 3. I was going through an old box of my own childhood things, looking for a photo of my mother to include in the ceremony slideshow, when I found something Susan clearly hadn't known I still had. A small key taped to the inside of an old jewelry box that had belonged to my mother, with a tag in her handwriting that read only a bank name and a number. I sat on my bedroom floor for a long time, holding that key, feeling the particular vertigo of realizing that a small, ordinary object might mean something enormous. I didn't think much of it that night, not fully. I put it in my purse and told myself I'd look into it eventually, once the wedding chaos calmed down. It sat there for almost a week, and I want to be honest that part of the delay wasn't practical. Part of me was afraid of what looking into it might mean, 3 weeks before my wedding, with so much already in motion. When I finally called the bank, sitting alone in my car outside a grocery store, the representative told me that the safety deposit box the key corresponded to had, in fact, been accessed twice in the past 15 years. Both times by someone other than me, using power of attorney documents that had apparently been drawn up shortly after my mother's death, while I was still a grieving, 12-year-old, with no idea any of this existed. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. It wasn't rage, not yet. It was a colder, quieter kind of dread. The specific feeling of realizing that a story you'd accepted for most of your life might not be the real one. I sat in that car for almost 20 minutes before I felt steady enough to drive. I didn't confront Susan, not yet. Instead, I did something I'd never had a reason to do before. I called my mother's old attorney, a man named Gerald Hoffman, who I hadn't spoken to since I was a child, whose name I only remembered because it was listed on an old folder in that same box. I explained what I'd found, my voice, I'm sure, betraying more uncertainty than I wanted it to. There was a long pause on the phone. Long enough that I thought the call had dropped before he said, carefully, that he needed to check something and would call me back within the week. Those days waiting for his call were some of the strangest of my life. I went through the motions of final wedding preparations, tasting cake samples, confirming seating charts, trying on my dress for the last fitting, while carrying this separate, entirely private question underneath all of it. I remember standing in the dress, looking at myself in the mirror at the bridal shop, and feeling, for just a moment, like I was looking at two entirely different people occupying the same reflection. Gerald called back 4 days before my wedding. He told me that my mother had, in fact, left a will. A full, legal binding will, drawn up 2 years before she died, naming me as the sole beneficiary of a modest but real inheritance, along with several personal items she'd specifically wanted me to have when I turned 25. He told me that document had never been formally executed, because shortly after her death, someone had filed paperwork claiming the will had been superseded by a later, informal arrangement. Paperwork that, conveniently, only Susan had ever seen, since she'd been the one managing the estate, on behalf of a grieving child too young to understand any of it. Gerald told me, gently, that he still had a copy. That it had simply been sitting, unexecuted, in an old file for 17 years, because nobody had ever formally challenged the version of events Susan presented after my mother died. He also mentioned something else, almost as an aside, that I couldn't stop thinking about for days afterward. That around the time of the superseding paperwork, Susan and my father had also taken out a second mortgage on the house. One I'd never known about. One that lined up, suspiciously closely, with a period when my father's business had nearly gone under. I don't know, even now, exactly how those two things connect. But I've stopped believing in convenient coincidences. I asked him, my voice steadier than I felt, whether he would be willing to bring that copy somewhere specific, on a specific date. He asked me why. I told him about the wedding. There was another long pause, and then he said, in the calm, unhurried voice of a man who'd clearly seen families do far worse to each other over far less, that he would be there. I didn't tell my father. I didn't tell Marcus, not the specifics, only that there was something I needed to handle quietly, on my own terms, and that I'd explain everything once it was done. I wanted, more than anything, for this not to become a scene I engineered out of anger. I wanted the truth to simply arrive, the way it had almost arrived for me by accident, and let it land exactly where it needed to land, in front of the people who had spent 17 years believing a different story. The morning of the wedding, Susan was, predictably, everywhere. Directing florists, adjusting seating charts, glowing under the compliments of relatives, who'd praised her devotion to me for nearly 2 decades. I watched her work the room, with the same practiced warmth she'd always had. And for the first time in my life, I watched it from the outside, like watching a performance I finally understood the mechanics of. It is a strange, almost dizzying thing, to look at someone you've loved your whole life and suddenly see the seams in something you'd always assumed was simply real. Susan? My father found me alone for a few minutes before the ceremony, in the small room where I was getting ready. He told me, in his own quiet way, how proud he was, how much he wished my mother could see me. I remember almost telling him everything right then, standing there in my dress with 20 minutes before the ceremony. I didn't. I told myself it wasn't fair to him, not yet, not until I understood the whole picture myself. Looking back, I think I was also protecting the last few minutes of a version of that day, that hadn't yet been complicated by anything. The ceremony went beautifully. Marcus cried during his vows, which surprised both of us, and I meant every word of my own vows to him. Whatever else was happening beneath the surface of that day, none of it touched the part of it that was actually about him, about us. And I want that to be clear, before I tell you what happened next. There is a version of this story where the wedding itself becomes collateral damage to everything else. And I worked very hard, in the moment, to make sure that didn't happen. At the reception, during the toasts, Susan stood up. She'd insisted on this months earlier, over my quiet protests, and gave a long, warm speech about raising me as if I were her own. About the bond we'd built despite everything life had thrown at us, about how proud my mother would surely be, watching from wherever she was, to see how well Susan had taken care of me. She even paused, at one point, to dab at her eyes with a napkin, and the room, predictably, softened toward her even further. The room applauded, warmly, genuinely. Several older relatives wiped away tears of their own. I smiled, because I had learned, over 17 years, exactly how to smile through moments like this, how to hold an expression steady while something entirely different moved underneath it. And that's when Gerald Hoffman walked in. He wasn't invited, technically, though I'd quietly arranged with the venue staff to let him through when he arrived, giving them his name and a photo, so there'd be no confusion at the door. He walked in wearing a plain, gray suit, carrying a single sealed envelope, and made his way directly toward the head table with the unhurried confidence of a man who has delivered difficult news to families for 30 years and long ago stopped being nervous about it. I saw Susan notice him before almost anyone else did. I watched her face change in real time, the practiced warmth draining out of it, replaced by something much harder to perform through. I don't think I will ever forget that specific transformation, the speed of it, the way 17 years of careful performance seemed to evaporate in under 2 seconds. Gerald reached the table and, with quiet, measured courtesy, asked if he could have a brief word. I stood, and asked him, in front of everyone, to simply say what he'd come to say. Because I was done, after that day, carrying secrets that weren't mine to carry alone. I remember my own voice sounding steadier than I expected, almost as though some other, calmer version of myself had stepped forward to handle this specific moment. He explained, calmly, to a room that had gone almost entirely silent, that he was the attorney who had drafted my late mother's will 17 years earlier. He explained that the will had never been properly executed, due to a superseding document filed shortly after her death. A document he had recently reviewed again, at my request, and found to contain irregularities significant enough that he felt professionally obligated to bring the original will back into the light, along with his concerns, before too much more time passed. He held up the envelope. He read, briefly, the date on the original will, dated a full 8 months before the superseding document Susan had filed, which, under any reasonable legal standard, meant the original will should have governed everything from the start. The silence in that room was unlike anything I'd experienced. My father's face was a mixture of confusion and dawning horror, his eyes moving slowly between Gerald, the envelope, and Susan, as if physically trying to reassemble 17 years of assumed history into a new shape. Susan's face had gone completely white, the practiced warmth entirely gone, replaced by the look of someone doing rapid, panicked math in front of 300 witnesses. I watched her hand tighten around her wine glass, her knuckles going pale. And for just a moment, before she managed to compose herself again, I saw something underneath the performance that looked almost like fear.
I didn't yell.
I didn't stand up and deliver some triumphant speech I'd rehearsed for weeks. I simply thanked Gerald, quietly, for coming, and told the room that this wasn't a conversation for a wedding reception, that Marcus and I still had a marriage to celebrate, and that everything else could and would be handled, properly, through proper channels. In the days that followed, I asked the band to start playing again. Slowly, hesitantly, conversation returned to the room, though I could feel, for the rest of the night, a different texture underneath it. The particular hum of 300 people quietly recalculating everything they thought they knew. I want to be honest about why I chose that moment, that setting. Instead of a quiet lawyer's office, part of me knew that Susan had built her entire identity, for 17 years, on being seen as the devoted stepmother, performed carefully and specifically for an audience. I didn't think it was fair for the correction to happen only in private, invisible to the very people she'd spent all those years performing for. I wanted the truth to exist in the same room the performance had always lived in. I have thought, many times since, about whether that was the right choice, whether a quieter reckoning might have been kinder. I still don't fully know the answer. But I know I couldn't have gone through with the alternative. Smiling through that toast, knowing what I knew, and saying nothing at all. The days that followed were difficult in ways that are hard to fully capture. There were lawyers, and paperwork, and long, uncomfortable conversations with my father, who I believe genuinely hadn't known the full extent of what Susan had done, though I've had to make my own peace with how much he chose not to ask, for 17 years, about a version of events that was clearly convenient for their household finances. About 2 weeks after the wedding, in one of the more difficult conversations, my father admitted something to me that reframed things further. He told me that in the year after my mother died, their family finances had been in far worse shape than I'd ever known. The second mortgage Gerald had mentioned, business debts, a period where he genuinely feared losing the house. He didn't say it as an excuse, exactly, but I understood, listening to him, that whatever Susan had done with my mother's estate, it hadn't happened in isolation. There had been pressure, desperation, a young marriage trying to stabilize itself financially, in ways that made cutting a grieving child out of an inheritance feel, to two frightened adults, like a solvable problem, rather than a devastating betrayal. Understanding that didn't excuse it. But it made the whole situation feel less like a simple villain and victim story, and more like the messy, complicated thing most families' betrayals actually are. Susan and I have not spoken since the wedding, beyond the strictly necessary logistics handled through lawyers. I don't know if we ever will speak again in any real way. I've made a kind of peace with that. Some relationships, once the actual foundation beneath them is exposed, simply cannot hold the same shape they held before, and pretending otherwise would only be another performance, one I'm no longer willing to give, for her or for anyone else. Melissa, my cousin, called me the week after the wedding. She didn't say, "I told you so," though she would have been entirely justified in saying it. She just asked how I was doing, and let me talk for almost 2 hours about all of it. The key, the phone call, the terrace, Gerald walking in, Susan's face. At the end of the call, she told me something I've held on to since. That she thought my mother would be proud, not of the confrontation itself, but of the fact that I hadn't let 17 years of someone else's story replace my own for good. What I keep coming back to, in the weeks since, isn't anger, though there was plenty of that at first, in waves, usually late at night when the house was quiet, and I had nothing left to distract myself with. It's something quieter, underneath the anger. My mother, 17 years ago, sick and running out of time, took the time to make sure I'd be taken care of, even though she wouldn't be there to see it happen herself. She wrote things down in that notebook she never let me read, made arrangements, thought carefully about a future she wouldn't live to witness. Someone tried to erase that. And it took 17 years. One small key taped inside an old jewelry box. And a wedding day I almost let pass without ever knowing the truth, for that erasure to finally be undone. I think about my mother often now, more than I have in years. Not with the diffuse, generalized grief I carried through my 20s, but with something more specific. Gratitude, mostly, for a woman who thought carefully enough about my future, even while she was dying, to make sure a piece of her would still be waiting for me. Whenever I was finally ready to find it, I've started going through the contents of that safety deposit box slowly, a little at a time, because some of it is difficult to look at all at once. Old photographs, a few pieces of jewelry, and yes, that notebook, finally readable, filled with small, ordinary observations about raising me that she never got the chance to say out loud. I didn't do this for money, though the inheritance itself matters, practically, in ways I won't pretend it doesn't. I did it because 17 years is a long time to let someone else's version of your own history stand in for the truth, and I've learned, through all of this, that the truth doesn't always arrive loudly, or on your timeline. Sometimes it waits, quietly, in an old box, in a small taped key, for exactly the right moment to finally be found. Marcus and I are settling into married life now, slowly, the way you do after a wedding that turned out to be far more eventful than either of us expected. He's been patient with me through all of it, in a way I don't think I've fully thanked him for yet. My father and I are talking again, carefully, in the halting way people talk when they're rebuilding something, rather than continuing something. It's not the relationship we had before. I'm not sure it should be. But it's honest. In a way our relationship hadn't been in a very long time, and I've come to think that honesty, even complicated, uncomfortable honesty, is worth more than the smooth version we had before. And when it is found, that kind of truth, you don't have to shout to make it matter. You just have to let it stand, finally, in the light it was always owed.